That was it? I shouldn't have done that. You're right. A lost one at Lenore City that has never been found since. But anyway, if you see it, just set it up here on the pew. Thanks for the reading. Our takeaway reading is Matthew 11:28-30, and we're talking about yokes, Jesus versus the Pharisees. Jesus doesn't mention Pharisees in these verses, but he lets us know that the primary opposition to him, and we see that all along because people are always Pharisees, calling him out for ridiculous stuff, a lot of it having to do with their misunderstanding of the Sabbath. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, but as he gets into the body of the sermon, except your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. So when he talks about, come unto me, all you who labor under heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He says, take my yoke upon you. We know from history of the time that it was said of the Pharisees that the Pharisees' yoke is hard. And we can imagine how hard it would have been to try to live up to the kinds of things that they were constantly throwing out. Every time Jesus turned around, they thought the holiest man that ever lived was being unholy. So it was constantly a dread, and religion isn't supposed to be like that. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. You'll find rest for your souls. We've got a tremendous contrast here between Jesus and the Pharisees, between labor, and labor isn't just working, it's where you're sweating and just really getting tired and wishing it would be over soon, and rest. It's a contrast between heavy and light. It's a contrast between hard and easy. And there are consequently major differences between the yoke of Jesus and the yoke of the Pharisees. And I fear, and we all have to be careful of this, that sometimes we take on aspects or characteristics of the Pharisees' yoke, and we do not realize the freedom and the rest and the joy that is in the yoke of Jesus. Well, what is a yoke? We're not talking about eggs here. What is a yoke? Oxen. Some of us here may have seen oxen yoked before, but it was very commonplace. When Paul is encountered on the Damascus Road by Jesus, he says it's difficult for you to kick against the goads, and that's an ox thing. They were in yoke, and lest they get carried away, there was a stick with a point on it, so if they got to going a little too fast, it'd jab them, and they would pull back. Paul was in trying to persecute the church and persecuting the church, found that that's what he was doing according to Jesus. Now, what is a yoke? No, it's responsibilities. Responsibilities are things that part of us kind of think, well, really, I don't like responsibilities. At the end of the day, we do like responsibilities, and we like being responsible. There's something about being a responsible human being that just makes us feel good. We're doing something that's worthwhile. We're trustworthy. We can be a people that folks will give responsibilities to. I've told you this before, but it really struck me when it happened at the youth group at Carnes many years ago, when the seniors were talking about getting out, and being able to be free. As they went off usually to Freed Hardeman. And one of them was sitting over there and just didn't say anything, and he usually was one to talk. And he said, we're forgetting something. What? And he said, the R word, responsibilities. Because Mama and Daddy had been responsible for a whole lot that they weren't going to be responsible for anymore. But accepting responsibility, I remember a guy I saw who graduated from a halfway house program, and he had been taught responsibility, whereas his whole life before him, which is why he was incarcerated, was about not being responsible. And with tears in his eyes, he thanked the lady that was over the program. Said, you're the first person in our lives that have ever made us feel like human beings, because you made us responsible. So responsibility is part of that. Expectations. We need to know what people expect of us, do we not? Expectations are good. They help us to sort out where we want to spend our time and how much we want to spend, such like. I started out in a household that didn't have any expectations, at least not really. I moved into with my grandmother, and wow, woman had expectations all over the place. But it was good, because when you fulfill expectations with somebody you love, that's just makes you feel good. And moving in the right direction. One of the things about a yoke, don't put a yoke on oxen for them to stand there. You put a yoke on oxen so that they can go in a certain direction and get somewhere that you need them to go, probably plowing a field and doing that in straight lines. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a yoke, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Jesus has a yoke. Well, Matthew 10, let's look at this. Everybody, all this, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, let's just look at something, because we got to make this work. I was talking to a friend not long ago, yesterday actually, via the amazing telephone, without actually talking and writing things. And he was talking about law and law keeping. We're going to talk about that tonight, Lord willing. And I hope it'll help us to clarify a lot of things in the Bible that maybe at times seem to be going in opposite directions. But look at this. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. You'll find rest, okay? Verse 32 beginning in Matthew chapter 10. This will harmonize. Law and the things that are said about it, we don't just take these and to go somewhere with them and these and go somewhere else with them. They harmonize. They fit together. And so it is with what Jesus is saying there in chapter 11 and what he says here in chapter 10. Therefore, everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and another daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. All these family relationships. I've come to set people against each other. Now, this isn't, as I hope we realize, his primary purpose, but it is a necessary aspect of the consequences of what he stands for. And the man's enemies be the members of his household. He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life shall lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake shall find it. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. You will find rest. These things are true. Not peace, but a sword. Divide families. Take up a cross. Harmonize with our reading from Matthew 11:28 to 30. The Sermon on the Mount is a good place to sort of look at this. And we find what we just mentioned a moment ago in 5:20 of Matthew. Except your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. So what's up with that? Well, Jesus said it starts with attitude, the Beatitudes. It's not spelled like attitudes, it's a little bit different, but it sounds a lot like it. And they are attitudes, that's what they are talking about. We are aware of things like in Proverbs, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. Our attitudes about life determine how we live and how people relate to us. We all know people who have bad attitudes, right? And how do we know that? because it boils over into the decisions they make, the way they deal with people, the things they have to say. We also know some people who have good attitudes. We like to be around them, do we not? They help us to feel better and encourage us. And so attitudes are very important. And if you look at the Beatitudes, you don't find these if you go to the bookstore to find the self-help way to appreciate yourself and all that. These are counterintuitive, but they work. They absolutely do. But it starts with attitudes, Jesus' yoke. It deals with others. I don't know if the song's in our songbook or not. I hadn't heard it sung in forever. It's called Others. Others, Lord, yes, others. And talking about how we need to be looking out for others. Selfishness looks to ourselves. And the Pharisees at the end of the day were a very selfish people. They wanted it their way, and they wanted to be getting the people to call out to them and talk about how wonderful they were. They wanted to be the top dogs in religion. They wanted to tell people what to do and what not to do. They wanted to make the judgments, all of that out of their pride. And so they didn't care about others. Others were just there to give them greetings in the marketplace or things like that. They weren't there to be served. Jesus was a servant. And a saying of Jesus that we have in Acts that isn't in the Gospels, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And I think we've probably all recognized that when we give something to somebody that they really appreciate, that just gives us something, a glow inside that we don't get when we receive things. Principles. The New Testament, fairly small. Half of it's the Gospels, which isn't a lot of just do this, don't do that. The epistles deal more with behavior in the church and Christians. But the Bible is a principle-based book. Once we understand the principles, then we can start living. The way of the Pharisees is, you notice those books in the slide? Why have I got those there? To make a point. I've overdone the point for purposes of illustration. There's a thing called the Talmud, or the Talmud, and that in the time of Jesus there were a lot of oral sayings. It was called the oral Torah, and it was said of the Jews who were making up laws that weren't in the Torah that Moses probably said this, that, and the other. He surely would have, and so that's the oral Torah. He wrote some stuff down, but he surely said a lot of other things that we'll let you know what they are and tell you to do them. So that gets to be, I'd have been afraid to move on the Sabbath. Every time Jesus moved, there's, wait a minute. But when you live a principle-based life, it's a lot easier. You just go by the principles. They just guide you and direct you, and it's a much easier lifestyle to pursue. Now, what's the rule here? What's the rule there? What's the rule there? That kind of thing. Scripture, not the traditions of men. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, they are amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one having authority. He went to the text and pulled out of it what it meant, not as their scribes. He talked about love and heart as being fundamental, and we find this throughout the New Testament. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3, whatever we do and whatever we are, if we don't have love, it's just a bunch of noise. So love is right in there, in the heart. Where does God look first? Remember when they're going to pick a new king to replace Saul, and they go to Jesse's house, and Eliab is there. Boy, he's a big, strong guy, probably a handsome fellow. And even Samuel, who's a pretty religious man, says, behold, the Lord's anointed is before me. And the Lord says, essentially, no, he's not. He said, do you have any other sons? Well, there's the youngest, David, who's out taking care of the sheep. He's the one, because you see, God tells Samuel that God doesn't look on the outward appearance, but he looks on the heart. And this is not the way of the Pharisees at all. Consider a parental model. We've all had parents and other people significant to us who helped to raise us. And in a good situation like that, there is authority, is there not? There are rules, there are expectations, there are responsibilities, there are punishments. But in a good situation, children love being in a household. They love being taken care of. They love being nurtured. They love being protected. They love being loved. And so the things that are their responsibilities are not the kind of things, the first time I really encountered responsibilities, I went to Philadelphia for the New York World's Fair. Quite a fair it was. I think it was a little bigger than the Knoxville World's Fair. So I go up there, spend some time with my Uncle Ed, that I'm named after, and my Aunt Dot, and I immediately, at the top of the steps, going up the top of the steps to the bedroom area, there are these lists. And there's a Donald list, and there's a David list, and there's an Edwin list. These were our responsibilities in the Lewis household. And you know what? I liked that. I appreciated being able to be part of that family and do my part and take my responsibility. And that's the way it is in a family. We don't shun. We might for a while, but I think we eventually figure out this is a good thing. And that's kind of the way it is with Jesus' yoke. It's a family type setting. And yes, we have to put him first, but we want to because we love him. He said in John 14, 15, and 23, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Love is a powerful force. All right. There is a yoke to wear. Christianity has a yoke. We were talking about in our class this morning about how can we get people interested in doing the things of Jesus. Maybe visit with us and check out what we're up to. Because especially with our young people, but maybe with everybody, there's a lot of competition out there. And it's got a lot of razzmatazz and confetti and skyrockets and such. Well, it might seem that we're a little dull here, but we're not. It's not dull to go about the Lord's will. It's not dull to be transformed into the image of Jesus. It gives life substance and meaning. And so there is a yoke to wear in Christianity. There are responsibilities to take up in that regard. But there's a perverse attraction to legalism. There just is. And people, they like their lists. Do this, do that, do this, do that, making things up. I'm going to illustrate one of them. It goes far enough back to where I don't think I'm going to embarrass anybody, but who knows? Maybe I will. There was a Christian school that I was in close proximity to one time when I lived for 30 years in Carnes. And I remember the boys, if they wore shorts, they had to cover their knees, because you know how people are prone to lust after young boys' knees. And so what they did to prevent this from happening was they would sew cloth that didn't match, often very much, so that the knee would get covered. That was a rule to prevent lust. Well, we laughed, and rightfully so. It's silly. And when we start making up rules and regulations, it just gets crazy. We need to, Jesus doesn't, if he wanted us to do something, he'd tell us. If the principles don't go along with it, we don't need to be caught up in all that kind of stuff. But there's a perverse thing. Well, you didn't do this, or got a glimpse of your knee, or whatever, that give people sort of an empowerment, I think, that we keep the rules and you don't, which is sort of how they came across, the Pharisees to Jesus. You're not washing your hands. We do. You're picking grain on the Sabbath. We'd never do anything like that. But it's just sort of a perverse, prideful pleasure in that we need to have nothing to do with. It's what crucified Jesus, and we don't want to be part of that. The yoke of legalism is slavery. The kinds of things we're talking about enslave us to lesser things. They keep us away from the things that God really wants us to give our major attention to. In Matthew 23:23, he says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, after saying, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. But you neglect the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the other. So even if it's legit law that we ought to do, it needs to be put in its place behind the principles. Luke adds in his parallel, love. And those are the things that enliven law, give the purpose for law, give the meaning. What did Jesus say in Matthew when he asks the great commandments? And he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. If laws don't filter through love, they don't have the context for them to be what God wants them to be. And Jesus' yoke has that. Jesus' yoke is the freedom to be what we were made to be. How about that? God created us. What's the best way for us to live? The Jesus way. What will be most harmonious to who we are as individuals? The Jesus yoke is perfectly aligned with who we are and the way God made us. And so there is a yoke. And yes, it does put Jesus first. And sometimes that brings some painful things in life. When the gospel was first being preached, there were Jews who would come to Jesus. Pentecost, you got 3,000 souls. And the opposition began to grow against those Jews who had become Christians. It got to the place where even today in some strict Jewish households, if somebody goes into Christianity, they will have a chair at the table and a place set. And if anybody asks, oh, that was our daughter, or that was our son, they're dead now. They weren't dead. They'd become Christians. And so there are various ways that bearing that yoke, which is light and easy, nevertheless means there would be some difficult decisions to make. So, if you're thinking about being a Christian, one of the things you need to think about is Jesus' invitation. There's more than just the Great Commission when it comes to what Jesus wants us to do. In Matthew 11, 28 to 30 is a part of him calling us to wear his yoke. If you're not wearing it, you haven't accepted his responsibility. Your life isn't being molded in that way to be like what you were made to be and have the best kind of life you possibly can have. And feel that sense of, I'm doing what I need to be doing. I'm imperfect with it, always will be, but this is the way I ought to live. It just makes sense. But why not become a Christian? Put him on in baptism. Even this day, let the old person die and the new person start walking in a new creation, as that yoke will direct us and will take us where we need to go and let us be what we need to be. To those of us who are Christians, there is a yoke. We have responsibilities, primary responsibilities to Jesus. He must come first. Every once in a while, we just need to remind ourselves of that. I know I do. If you need to respond to the invitation of Jesus, won't you do so while we stand to sing?